Welcome to Moving Money Right. My name is Fazia, and I love learning about financial infrastructure that exists all over the world, especially when it's being powered by technology, because I'm a software engineer. So, today's episode is going to be about how your favorite budgeting apps and financial products get access to your transactions data every time you spend your money. You probably recognize this logo because you've used it to connect your bank account to a product like Venmo or Splitwise. I don't work at Plaid, but my guest, Nick, is a staff software engineer there. We talk about how this work is getting easier because of things like FDX, and transaction foundation models are introducing new ways to use transaction data. Listen to this episode if you want to hear the story about what happens when you swipe your card and how that data eventually makes its way back to you. Hi, Nick. Thank you so much for talking to me. I'm really excited to have this conversation today about a very important player that a lot of people know of, but I think they don't know enough about. So I think generally in this space, there are key players that people have a good idea of, right? There's the networks like Visa and MasterCard, because they're the ones who own the payment rails that we use to like swipe our cards.
Yep.
And then there's the bank. But I think the aggregators, a lot of people recognize and know of and benefit from, but I think they don't really know exactly what they do and maybe how they do it. So Nick, because you work at Plaid, could you talk to me a little bit more about aggregators and what they do?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, when you buy a coffee, you swipe your card. The networks are really going to connect the customers, that merchant, to the bank. And then what happens after that, the customer's account, after the money goes out, really the aggregators are the story of what happens after that, right? So if you have a budgeting app, if you're tracking your money, aggregators provide ways to connect that banking world into the tech world.
Yeah.
This is really a way of kind of replicating the ledger. So, the bank holds a ledger that says the transactions are in there.
Right.
And then this is a way of getting that quickly into that, the high tech side of the world,
Right.
Out of sort of the finance side, more into the tech side.
Right. And so I bet maybe somebody's listening to like, oh, how hard could it really be? But I know it's very hard. And so, especially because I bet anybody who's watching this paid for their dinner with their card in the US and then they've tipped after. And maybe they've checked their bank app and they see that the tip isn't there, or like maybe it might start as 2 transactions. But eventually, aggregators like Plaid are able to get it into an end state where it is correct. So I'm curious, does this make your life harder as an aggregator? And like, what are some weird things that you've seen?
Well, yeah. So one of the things with an aggregator is smoothing it out for the developer. So you're thinking, there's thousands of banks and they all communicate in different ways. And there's all of, each one has its own nuance.
Yes.
So the tip example that you have, some of the strange things that you'll see is you mentioned this idea of, transactions that are mutating. And that's something that seems a little strange at first, but really that's like, over time, you're going to have a transaction that's going to come in. At first, you're going to have this really sort of cursory, like pending transaction that's going to have, the original amount. And then over time, that's going to get updated as more information comes through.
Yes.
Like maybe the tip gets added.
Right.
And also descriptions change a lot too. So a lot of times there's like a placeholder description. Maybe it'll just say like debit. And then it'll actually change, up to like 4 or 5 times I've sometimes seen as more information goes in. Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of different players. There's the payment processors, there's the networks. All of them add on a little bit more information as it moves through that system. And the bank is going to kind of record that on. So you're going to end up, with a very, very sparse description at first, sparse information. Maybe it's not even going to have what restaurant it is at first. And then over time, it's going to get more and more. And it's going to sort of snowball into what you might see on your bank statement or you're going to want to see in your app. Some of the stranger things, I have a couple of things that, over the years I've seen. So one wild thing is, and these are not bugs. These is just working as intended. One of the banks that actually exists they will actually, over 3-day weekends or over weekends, they'll actually put the posted date in the future. So pending and posted state is really when the transaction is completed, right? Posted is when it's sort of, settled down and it's done. But that can't really happen over a weekend because that's over a banking holiday. So what they'll do conveniently is they'll just say, oh yeah, that's gonna post in the future. But this completely wreaks havoc because if you're building an app, you're assuming that now is as latest as it can be. So if you got like a scroll, you're scrolling through a list of transactions, you're not expecting things to be like up above the top of that list of transactions like in the future. And this is like perfectly valid in the banking world. But if you're a developer, this is completely bananas. So that's one example of something kind of crazy.
And now that we've kind of talked about aggregators a little bit, I'm curious to hear about another really important player, which is the developer, right? The Rocket Mortgage who's building their budget app, the Splitwise who's helping their customers move money, the person who's building Venmo for dogs, So why can't a developer just go to Bank of America to get the data? Like, why is the aggregator necessary?
Right. So there's a couple of things that developers care about. So the first one is they care about developing a product for their customers. So they want to spend most of their energy doing that. And if you're a small developer or even a big developer, you're going to be spending most of your time building features and not necessarily going to, be connecting to a bunch of banks. So that's one thing. The other thing that they'll care about is like consistency and not having to learn about all of the crazy things that happen on the bank and have to sort of special case those.
That's true.
Some of the stuff that we just talked about, there's all these different behaviors for different banks. Aggregators can provide a kind of bird's eye view of all of them. So, and specifically, like as a developer, you don't have bank accounts with all of the banks. So it's really hard to test that. So, it works on my machine, works with my bank account. It's not necessarily going to work with a branch bank or whoever you want to reach out to. So it's also about reach and being able to just sort of assume, hey, if it works for my bank account, it's going to work for everybody else. So that's kind of the first one is simplicity and kind of simplifying that so they can focus on, the real things that matter.
Right.
And then some of the others are, we mentioned that kind of tracking state through a transaction, right?
Yeah.
This transaction is updating and, there's dynamics there.
Yes.
Is there a sort of layer of abstraction on top of just bank statement information that they can get? And, that makes their lives even easier because they don't even have to worry about that. And there is that sort of larger primitive, they're dealing with maybe more of the tech side of fintech and less of the fin side of fintech. We've just been talking about something that's very like US centric. So outside of the US, even as close as like Canada, things are, the landscape is very, very different. If you look at Europe, there's a lot of debit cards. People just, their spending habits, it's not as credit card centric for a lot of historical reasons involving, something as crazy as like crackly French telephone lines back in the early days.
Okay.
So this is why like they adopted chip and pin a lot earlier than the US was actually the phone network system. So there's things like that where just historical reasons, just the way that people think about money is different and the way that the banking system and fintech works is different for those. So there, this has just been very like targeted on US.
That's true.
And as you start to explore all these others, there's all of these nuances for every single country or every single area. So I think that's the thing to flag is like, that's like another level of, even more complexity on top of this.
Yeah. I want to hear about what you said earlier where it's like all of these developers can't just create bank accounts at like 12,000 United States like institutions because of law. So I'm curious about efforts that have been made to standardize how like developers and all parties kind of talk to banks. So I've heard a lot about the FDX, which is like financial data exchange. And it's like these abstractions that a lot of people have put a lot of work into to make getting data so much more, to me at least, very standardized. So can you just tell me a little bit more about the FDX?
Yeah, so let me tell you a bit about FDX. So FDX, as you mentioned, it's kind of a standards organization. It's this consortium. It was made about 10 years ago. And the big idea was as the users of financial data have gotten more complicated than just each other or a bank statement, right? Because it used to be the world where, the interface that the bank would have on, like, say, transaction information would be they're going to print out a statement. So the format of that would just be the columns on the bank's statement that they'd send in the mail every month, right? And that was it. There were no, complicated apps. not as many use cases of that data being
That's
unlocked.
True. That's
And
true.
as there were more and more use cases, there was this need to really, for the banks to better understand that. And then also so that's sort of the, there's sort of a supply side and a demand side, where the supply side's the banks or the financial institutions, and the demand side are those, ever increasing, app developers or new use cases that are popping up. I mean, even if you think about something like Mint, many years ago, they're going to want certain fields on that previously weren't on a bank statement. So really the idea was to bring those different parties that are involved in this together to sort of talk about what the joint needs are, and then kind of agree on a standard. So even something as simple as like, what does a transaction look like? What fields? So something like a description and amount, like we can all agree on that, but like all sorts of other fields, like
loan transaction.
Exactly. And the FTX literally has almost everything that you can imagine in there around the formats of what it is to structure a financial system. Which is incredible. But that has really come from thinking about both the supply side and the demand side, and really like a design organization. Which means that now the industry is really talking in a common language, or even if they're not like aligned with the common language, there's some reference point where they can say, hey, we're going to do this like a little bit like FTX. And then suddenly we're in a better place where we don't have to be, you came from this bank world, that's how you think about it. Here's how you think about it. So it was really kind of this bringing people together to talk it through and talk about it, which is, I think, really really helped to unlock a lot of things, because you'll have those conversations, instead of like a developer just being frustrated, hey, why isn't there this field? There's this forum to kind of bring those things up.
I've been playing a lot with FTX, and I feel like it's actually really interesting to keep learning, especially the background behind it, and how like they were able to talk to several banks to kind of really have this foundation. I understand that like broadly the abstraction is standardized in a sense, but like, is the Bank of Omaha really using FTX? Like, I guess I'm just really trying to understand what are some practical challenges that.
I think you raise a really good point around a lot of the smaller banks don't necessarily have the resources. They're busy serving the community, serving their customers, being a bank. They like manning the teller window. You don't want to have that person have to go into the back and start working on servers, right? So a lot of times like it's not top of mind for them, but in this ecosystem, you may bank there, you may have gotten a mortgage there because they understand the community better than a larger bank might. And again, we're talking about customization. This is the old school customization is having a lot of sort of community banks and having a lot of smaller banks.
That's true.
But people still want to be able to use their, a high-tech app with that. And I think that's really a part where kind of aggregators come in and help with that burden a little bit, because, instead of the banks then having to immediately, everybody has to meet at that central point or meet the tech the tech standard. The aggregators can help bridge that gap a little bit, because it's kind of the good for everyone in terms of if they can have a website, or they can have something like that, there is some bridge that those aggregators can provide without the bank having to do a lot of work. So that's where we've seen a lot of just like generally just like good synergies and sort of like good vibes happening it's everyone is really focused on their job, right? You're focused on serving a community, serving doing those things, and then the sort of more technology side is focused on building those apps, and then the aggregators start to be able to build that bridge between. So everyone, like an orchestra, right? Everyone is playing their own part and really trying to hone in on being great at each of those parts, versus everybody trying to be a tech company, because
or a credit union.
Or a credit union, because nobody has it's hard to do everything at once really well.
That's true. So tell me a little bit more about Recon.
Well, first of all, because you're abbreviated Recon, I know that you've dealt with some of the complexities of it, because that's the same way as inside of Plaid. I'll know if somebody's worked with this, because they'll call it Recon for short, because they've been talking about it so much. Getting into that, I think reconciliation, you can sort of boil it down. So there's different types, there's different use cases of this. Like this is big in the accounting world. This is big in the data aggregator world. But kind of the big picture concept is, if you look at financial data, like we say that money flows. but really it's just a bunch of sort of snapshots. It's just rows in a database. Like you imagine a ledger, like at any given time, that ledger is just sitting there, right?
Yes,
so if you take a couple of snapshots in time and then you track a specific object throughout that. So you pick on one point and you say, I'm going to watch just this transaction move through.
Right.
That's really the process. The process of reconciliation is mapping, in this snapshot versus the next snapshot, what are those two related points? So it's a matching process. And what are those two related points? And once you have those two, points, you're making a line, and then you can make that longer thing. So going back to our example of the tip getting added, you might just see, some description that says like pending, I don't know, $25. And then you'll see another one that says posted $30. And there's not really a great matchup between them. Like sometimes there's identifiers, sometimes there's not. But the reconciliation is saying those two are actually conceptually the same. And now we're taking that information, we're going from like positional stuff to now we're talking about velocity. And velocity, you can say, this is getting added. So the idea of going from like two states, two like flat states to that added state, and even the concept of it being added is a type of reconciliation. Same thing with like a business, right? Like money coming in and money going out. It's the same thing. It's like you need to know what money's coming, going in, and then map it to the one that's going out. Like I made this much this month from these merchants. Here's where it's going. So that's really about reconciliation is really just like a mapping process in that way, but it really powers that whole concept of like movement of money.
Yes. Can you argue that everybody should be reconning their data? Do you feel like that's a case you're going to make? Or do you think some people don't, some people do? And this is okay. This can be your personal opinion.
So I think it's really like what you want to do with that.
Fair enough.
So again, just like I was talking about, like, nobody's, well, maybe some people, but I'm not getting excited. I'm not getting excited about like just that there is a number in a database.
Yes.
But I am getting excited about, money is flowing from like one place to another, and that behavior means something to the broader world, right?
Yes.
And reconciliation is the way to unlock that, right? You can't have money movement without matching transactions together for that, right? And I think that's really like that's the unlock where it goes from kind of dead data to like lively data or moving, moving around, animated data, right? So I would say that's reconciliation is the key to that. And then once you start moving it into these sort of like vectors or actions that are happening, you sort of can talk about stuff moving, then you can start talking about behaviors, right? So fraud, for instance, it's a behavior. So somebody, there might be a fraud ring that's moving money through a ring.
Right.
And, you have to have some way to match that is the same piece of money moving through the ring. So I would say reconciliation, like you can't talk about movement without reconciliation. And if you want to handle it at like kind of like start talking about those things, the verbs of money, reconciliation is kind of a necessary first step.
What is like something a practical maybe idea or practical tip that you would give to them as to thinking about like how to start capturing the verbs of money that they're like handling?
Well, so I think the really first thing is making sure that you're tracking all of the metadata associated with it. So a lot of times, like if you're taking in some transactions and you're only storing the amount and the date and maybe some of the description, you're maybe missing out on a lot of things that you could do with matching. So I think the first thing is capture as much as you can, because that's going to be helpful for tracking. And a lot of times, especially on business accounts, they'll make it really easy to map because, accountants need some kind of invoice number or things like that. There's a lot of like random numbers that get thrown in there in the business world, in the description or, in the metadata. So really first thing is like tracking so you're not losing anything that's coming in. And then I think once you sort of graduate from the tracking part, then starting to think about, kind of the mapping part, the actual reconciliation that you can do on top of it, right? So, and that a lot of times that will become like a sort of complicated data problem. So you want to collect enough of it across like a broad enough range, like across a bunch of, financial institutions or types of transactions to understand like, how can I start to find these patterns and match things? So there's some obvious ones like amount and date are some obvious ones, but then there's some like less obvious ones. You know, the description example. Description might not be a great matcher because that can change a lot.
Of course.
So I think like first you can capture a lot, and then once you've sort of built up that repository of data, then you can start to look at some rules that you can put in place, and even simple rules can go a long way. And then you start to kind of just burn down that list where maybe you've matched 80% of it, and then you've got that unknown part. You know, sometimes, you know, you can just infer a lot of the rest, because if something was there and then it's not there, you know, maybe it disappeared, or something wasn't there and then now it's here. Maybe it's, you know, appeared. Maybe that's an addition, right? So I would say that those are kind of like very first step, collect your data, collect as much data as you possibly can. Second step, look at your data, come up with some rules that you can, you know, use for matching, or maybe if there's some external information you can pull in, right? So an example might be, if you're a merchant, you might know more information than, you know, your bank knows, right? You may have your own tracking information. So mix in any extra context that you have, and then, you know, come up with a strategy and just kind of keep making that strategy better. And, you know, it's going to get better and better over time as you see more and more data. It's one of those things that snowballs. And if you start to set it up early, it's easier to, you know, to sort of track throughout. There's a funny game actually that was developed by someone at Stripe in the Stripe Japan office, which was the reconciliation game. And he just made this, it was like a video game. And the whole premise was that you are just this accountant that has to reconcile transactions. And this was made in order to just demonstrate how hard this is. So, you know, I always think about that when I'm thinking about like account recon is just the kind of the whimsy there, but it's important, right? To even understand that that's a step that, you know, people do, and that actually can be more complicated than you think.
I think we're all just becoming accountants. We're no longer engineers, we're just accountants. We're building our own ledger, we're doing recon, what next? So that is a really, really great segue into talking about something that I'm really curious about, transaction foundation models, which I feel like are a thing now where people who have this transaction data, so I guess the end users, they've taken all of that data and they're using it to do things that their population maybe, like they care about for their population specifically. So for example, like I've heard about Visa where they published this like white paper about like, it's called Transaction GPT. And they're using like all the transaction data that's happening over their Visa network to do like payment related tasks downstream. I've also heard about Stripe having its own, and they're using it to predict and prevent fraud. And so I'm curious, like, can you talk a little bit more about transaction foundation models? It makes sense that we've gotten to this point, right? Like if you've been aggregating all this data, of course people are gonna wanna use it to, you know, develop a clearer picture, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, so foundation models, the unlock here is, let's first talk about like what a traditional model is. So a traditional ML model is something where you are trying to predict a very specific thing. So an example would be you're trying to train a model to predict when your next paycheck is going to be. So that you might take in signals around when your last paycheck came in, things like that, right? And you can imagine it's going to, and then you'll send in the current day. So if it's the first, very high likelihood. If it's the second, very high likelihood, and then, you know, maybe the likelihood goes down depending on, you know, how people get paid. So, you know, in the past, that was something that you had to do every time. So that was really something that sort of slowed down and narrowed in what you could do and what questions you sort of ask about the data, because every time you would have to kind of reset the thing. And then, you know, maybe you'd have to get a, you know, data scientist to then like make you one of these things. A foundation model is a little bit different because you can sort of think about it as you're training a very large and very generalized model. So large meaning you're looking at a lot of data, and generalized meaning you're looking at a lot of like patterns and signals, and those signals you haven't like cherry picked exactly what you want to look for. So you're sort of encoding generalized behavior. So if you're looking at like a fraud model, that's going to be about like transaction behavior. So we were talking about reconciliation earlier of like, you know, one transaction, what's the life of the transaction? Where does it move? You know, does tip get added? All those things. We can think about like the bad transactions, like the bad actors, those are going to look a certain way, and you can learn, if you have enough data, you can learn those things. So it gets down to kind of that generalized thing where once you have one of these things, you don't need to know necessarily what you're looking for when you first train it, but as things emerge, you're able to ask it more general questions. So I could take like a foundation model and I could ask it about, when's your next, payment date going to be, but I could also ask it about other things, right? And I think that's really the unlock, is that you don't need to know originally what you're looking for to then be able to apply it. So, your app for dogs, there might be some aspects around that where that foundation model could support some feature of that without having to like retool a whole situation.
Yeah, and then you can expand to offer for cats and for other types of pets.
Exactly.
Because you have your models very general.
Exactly. So that's kind of the space, and this is becoming more possible because we have bigger compute and we have those things. But you can think about it as just like, you're not looking for one needle in a haystack. You're looking for making sort of a generalized metal detector or something.
Yeah. 20 years from now, what do you think, like with all these advancements that we're making, especially with financial software, what are some predictions or things that you think be even more exciting?
So I think like personalization is a big one to kind of, we're going to see a lot of expansions in. So we already know that something like personal finance apps are not specific to a certain we used to just have like Mint or something like that, right? And everybody learned how to use Mint. Mint wouldn't really learn how you like to spend money.
That's true.
I think we could have an ecosystem where there's almost a way of managing money for that's customized. Like, so we already know that there's a customization angle to this. And then we also already know that foundation models and these bigger, more flexible models are going somewhere. So we already see some AI companies starting to get into this finance space where we've got people designing their own personal finance apps and their own tabulation. And I think that's sort of like, maybe that's where we're going to start to see the shift is, we've got things feeling more and more personal, and you being able to actually find the perfect way to interact with that money and to sort of like make it your own. So I think that's where we're going to see a lot of that, is that it's going to be less of you learning how to use the system and more of the system learning how to, what your natural patterns are, and then maybe how to adapt those if you want to, save for a vacation or something like that, and financial goals. And even something like saving for retirement, right now there's like a formula, but maybe we're going to start to see that melt away. And I think we're probably already starting to see this in a lot of spaces, melt away to be something that's a little more, ergonomic. It's not like, are you like a type this investor or you're type this investor. It's actually, it's a smooth spectrum. So I think that's what we're going to see, a lot more applications there just across the board, which is really exciting because, it's more customization means your money's working better for you.
I agree. If like somebody's watching this episode and they're like, wow, like I recognize Plaid's logo because I've used them to connect to my bank before. It's really interesting to know that they're doing all this fetching and they're getting all this data and they're getting it reliably for like my Rocket Mortgage budget app or my Venmo app. What is something you think a lot of people might not know about aggregators like Plaid, Yodlee, MX that maybe you think could be interesting or like intriguing to them?
From the developer point of view, so first, I think there's some misconceptions from a developer point of view, and then there's often some misconceptions from the like consumer point of view. So I think from the developer point of view, a lot of folks will try to do exactly what you mentioned, where they're going to try to take the list of the top 5 largest banks, and then they'll just build against those APIs, because a lot of those APIs are really great. Like the big banks have invested a lot in technology, and those are some really great interfaces. And then they'll find that when they're trying to their app doesn't work for folks in Canada, or their app doesn't work for
Bank of Omaha.
Exactly, like the sort of like long tail. And that's something where we actually see a lot of developers kind of go through this learning process of that. It is actually very complicated, and once you go beyond the first few banks, it ends up getting very complicated very quickly. So I think that's one thing. I think the other angle, and this overlaps with the consumers as well, is around like safety and things like data consent, and really like being in charge of your own data. That's something that the aggregator can help do, right? So an example is the ability to be able to unlink your
Yes,
bank.
yes,
So you
yes,
don't
yes.
want to share your data with your dog app anymore. Being able to cancel that, and then, the aggregator deletes its data, and then the app deletes its data. All of those processes can be pretty complicated to put in. And you don't
Right.
think
And
about that when
manage.
you're first building this. You don't think
That's
about
true.
compliance or consent or anything
That's
like that.
true.
And that's something that, like, you can, if you're investing in that centrally, it can be a bit easier to get those things right, because there's a lot of complexity around that. You might just see this pane and it's like, okay, this this is just some plumbing,
Right,
which
right,
it is,
right.
but it's also like this plumbing also can help make things safer, or kind of think about you, and all of those things. So I think those are sort of some of the hidden aspects that people might not think about aggregators when they first start learning about them.
Interesting. If you have been a plumber for 10 years, when you see the like same houses or the same pipes, you kind of just know how to do it really well. And so it sounds like the point you're trying to make is that aggregators are reliable because because of the fact that they're seeing like all of these banks, and they're doing like this transporting of data work over like a long period of time, so they understand the compliance stuff, the regulation stuff, etc.
Well, you really want like a plumber. You don't want a handyman.
Exactly.
That's
You want somebody who this is their career.
You don't want somebody like they duct tape your sewer line and they're like, we're good for a couple weeks.
Exactly. So it's almost like instead of having to fetch every single integration that you've done, you can be able to rely on the aggregator to like unlink versus link like your bank account, like control that integration for you.
Exactly. Like by going through that sort of intermediary hop, you're able to keep track of these things. You're able to like monitor them too, right? If the dog app is starting to access things that you really, don't want it to,
or
right?
Your dog dies, and you just don't want that anymore.
Oh, this is getting dark. No, but it's exactly like that, right? It's that hub, and you can also see operating systems doing this in terms of settings, right? So like the iPhone, you can have a lot of those things where an app is going to, it's accessing your microphone for 6 hours the other day, like what's going on?
Location,
right? Sharing your location, things like that. So you can start to build those things in, but you can only build that in if you're sort of going through that hub that kind of works for you.
That's true.
Because the app developer, you're paying them, but like they're not necessarily like kind of working for you. You're sort of buying them, right? Yeah.
That's true. Or they're working for you to do a specific thing,
right?
Not
the holistic sharing part.
Exactly.
I often think about this. Before I was at Plaid, I was at Dropbox for 5 years, and I think people would ask the same question, right? Like, what draws you to files? And the answer is it doesn't like. The draw is not the files, it's the ubiquity of those files. So everyone has the thing that's common about files and money is that everybody's got them, or almost everybody's got them, and it's what you do with those that make it interesting.
That's true.
I think the thing that keeps being interesting about fintech and working at Plaid is interacting with all of these spaces. It's really a lens on all these spaces. So I talk about, I was talking about lending.
Yes.
That's something where that's one use case of the money. But, really what people are trying to do is they're trying to, get a house, or they're trying to, get a credit card, right? They're not thinking necessarily about, an amount moving through a database.
That's true.
So it's really kind of like what we can power through that keeps me motivated, because there's a lot of really clear lines to great impacts that can happen if the financial system is a lot easier to use and folks can participate in it better.
That's true. I know we talked about people who are probably building Venmo for dogs, but more seriously, what are some emerging like high leverage use cases for transaction data that you're particularly excited about and you think are really cool?
Yeah, so I think one that's I'm seeing evolving, and I think is really going to change, or it's already changing the industry, is the lending space, because sort of like the traditional lending space, a lot of it has been about kind of a set of surprising things like financial advice where you're a teenager and you should open a credit card, and you wonder I think we most of us have been there, and you wonder like, why am I opening a credit card? I'm like not
I'm
spending.
14.
Why can't I just use like some cash that's in my pocket or like something like that? But really, like that's how the financial system. This was the simplification around lending that really started early on, because we didn't have the ability. Like lenders, if you're going and getting a loan or opening a credit card, they didn't have the ability to sift through reams and reams of paper. So they would say, hey, you're going to participate in this
right.
sort of ecosystem. You know, we're going to have credit cards, we're going to have credit card limits, we're going to track, you know, whether you pay it. And that's sort of like a simplified state of, you know, that you're trustworthy with money, or you budget your money and things like that. And that was kind of a shortcut because almost like of a technology limitation. Fintech can kind of change that in terms of, and, you know, aggregation and, you know, having lots of data, because we can now sift through the real stuff. So if you're going to buy a house or something, you don't need to, you know, you can actually show that you're good for it in ways beyond just when you were a teenager, you had the foresight to open a credit card and, you know, pay it off on time and all of those things. So I think really like that's how the picture is changing, because you're able to have more real data points to demonstrate that you're good there. And you're able to then share kind of a bigger picture of yourself as a person who's, you know, who's getting a loan. And if you look at this on kind of the macro scale, if you look at like housing, for instance, and, you know, buying a house, right? This is a huge dream. I mean, it can really like change sort of the trajectory of somebody's life, right? Things like school districts and all of that, right? You know, even just like living where you want to live. That's something that, you know, most home buying is through mortgages and through those things. So you can think about, you know, if you're able to demonstrate your actual self and your financial patterns and, you know, in a really good way, and you're able to process all that data and connect all that data, you're able to end up sort of connecting better and having better lending products, and then participate in that like sort of financial system a little bit better. And that can really, I think that's a really huge unlock, because it's something that's actually kind of good for all the parties, because it's good for the lenders because they'll know more about you. It's good for you because it's a clearer picture, right? And I think that's one of the huge unlocks that I'm seeing kind of happening, you know, both in the financial system, but also sort of socially and just globally, which is fantastic. And then I think the other one is really how standards are changing around money movement and how that's changing the, you know, the fraud ecosystem, but also the developer ecosystem, but also what people are able to do. So if you look at like RTP, so like real-time payments, that is fantastic, because you don't have to wait, you don't have to use the old ACH system to move money from one place to another, which saves a bunch of time. And then you don't have to use wire transfers for everything either. If you need fast money transfer. But then there's a challenge around fraud here, because if you don't have that period of time where the holding period with ACH, you then have, you know, the criminals are able to get that money far away from law enforcement before they have a chance to track it down. So you end up getting this sort of balance where as things get easier and easier, and as the payment systems and financial systems upgrade, then the really frameworks around a lot of these systems have to get better and better to keep up with that speed. So I think that's going to be a really interesting space, because, you know, you talk about computing getting faster and faster to say, you know, answer a ChatGPT query. It also has to get faster and faster to keep up with money movement that's getting faster and faster, and make sure that it remains safe and reliable and those kinds of things. So I think we're going to see a lot of shift of, you know, as these fundamental primitives necessarily get better and faster. We also have a whole industry around how do we sustainably do that, you know, in a world where things that were true, you know, for the last 30 years, maybe 40 years, maybe longer, suddenly, you know, the world is turned on its head.
No, I'm so glad that we have people like you who are very smart and willing to talk and have these conversations, because I think the more we talk about these things with each other, the more we learn about concepts that we don't know, and the more we help each other become better as the ecosystem gets better. So thank you again, Nick, for talking to me. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that a lot of people leave knowing more about aggregators than they did before. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.